Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 5.20, and in this lesson we're going to talk about analog synthesis. I'm going to do a really quick history lesson for you guys, then we're going to jump back into Bitwig and we're going to analyze the signal flow of a classic analog synthesizer, okay? The Polysynth being our example. This is just the first of a number of videos on the Polysynth, but I want to start by showing you guys the classic signal flow because you know how much I stress that in all of my videos, whether we're talking just going from one effect into another, or now we're actually talking about the instrument itself. So strap in, it's going to be a lot of fun, and let's get started. So when I last left you, we were looking at the organ, and this is, of course, an emulation of the very famous Hammond B3 organ. We have our drawbars here, and as we increase these drawbars, we're starting to add some additional harmonics into our frequency spectrum. The Hammond organ was first developed, I believe, in the 30s, along with the Leslie speaker cabinet that might have come a little bit later. But the sound generation technology isn't anything like what we have in the analog synthesis. We have this wheel here that's going to spin, and along the line there's a bunch of different tone generators. It's fairly advanced. I honestly don't understand it, but basically this is just going to allow us to hit keys, and as we hit keys, depending on the drawbars that are pulled out here, and you can barely see them in my other video, I think I get a closer view, and that's going to get our sound. Okay, so this was in the 30s. The Moog synthesizers, they came much later, and these are the most famous examples of analog synthesis. This came around in the 60s, and this wasn't the first synthesizer to be made. They used to make these really huge modular synths, and those synthesizers would take up full rooms. You can search for the Moog modular, M-O-O-G. And when you search for that, you're going to see just how big these things were and how there's all these sorts of patch cables patching things in all over the place. Not really friendly for consumers, for the average consumer, much like original computers, right? They were take up entire rooms and they didn't have that much power. Modular synthesizers do have a ton of power though, so I would encourage you to check that out if you're interested. I'm showing you this synth because it's a great example of how something so simple can do just so much and has had such an important role in the history of electronic music. So analog synthesizers are all about voltage. Voltage is alternating current. Sound is vibration. Sound has those stages of amplification and rarefaction, right? We go above, we go below, etc., 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 in a cyclical sort of way. And voltage does something very similar. So it didn't take too long for people to think, is there a way I can control voltage, which is very similar to how sound is with vibration, and actually create an instrument? Use voltage as the means so that I can make something totally new and interesting. And that's exactly what they did with the Moog here. And you can see we have a variety of sections, and that's the other thing I want to draw your attention to. If you learn how to program one analog synth, it's not too hard to figure out all the other ones because you're going to look for those familiar names, those familiar factors. We have controllers or modulators. We have our oscillator section right here. We have a mixer section. We have a filter. We have our loudness contour, which today would be like the ADSR envelope, our amplitude envelope. And then we have a master output. Also a power switch. That's always helpful too, right? If we take a look at the back of this MiniMoog, very, very complicated. We could actually pull this out and see even more analog technology going on underneath there. And it goes to show that it's not the front panel. The front panel is very simple. But what really makes this unique, what's made this so powerful, so musical, and so well loved is what's going on here in the back. And there's so much circuitry, there's so much electronics and engineering going on back here. A lot of this, all of this had to be done by hand. And that is why people love it so much, because each and every one of these are unique. And as they get old and as they wear, we start to get imperfections. And those imperfections only add character. Music and sound, it's not perfect. And so it's great that an instrument like the Moog synthesizer came out because it also wasn't perfect. And when things aren't perfect, they tend to be more musical. So over the years, and now 40, 50 years later, we're still developing a bunch of different analog styled synths with voltage at the core to control and create different tones and allow us to sculpt the harmonic series into something that we can then try to use in our own compositions, whether it be leads, basses, pads, whatever the situation. And just recently, something like the bass station has come out, and it's utilizing the same basic principles and technology that the Moog did all those years ago, and it's still so well loved. What I want you to see here is that we have the same kind of sections. I know you can't read these, but I actually have one sitting next to me just a few feet away. There's an oscillator section, a mixer section. We have that same ADSR envelope right here, and that can control both modulation and amplitude. We have the main volume control over here, the voltage controlled amplifier. We also have our modulators. So it's all about just finding those sections. And when you find the sections, you'll know what you need to do with them. Now, in addition to having pure analog-driven, analog technology synthesizers, we also have developed what is known as, in this case, it says Advanced Simulated Analog Synthesizer, really these sort of classic emulation-based pieces of hardware. The Virus B is what I think the Polysynth was designed after, and I actually have a Virus B, and it sounds very similar to what the Polysynth sounds like. It looks very similar to what the Polysynth looks like. Only these are using a lot of digital technology, a lot of microprocessors, and power that we've only recently sort of started to tap into, especially in the audio realm. So we have oscillators, we have a mix control, we have filters, an amplifier, modulators, etc. All our usual suspects, but instead of looking like this, and again, if you pull this out, it gets even more crazy, we have this. So this is the motherboard, right? It's completely different, but the goal is the same. It's trying to emulate the analog sound, and it does so with more complex computing power than pure analog components. It also means this is less likely to break down, and so you can use it for longer without having to send it in for repairs, which is very helpful. Now what we're most familiar with are the plug-in software emulations of subtractive synthesizers. And I can go through a few of the more famous ones. We have Massive. Yes, I know it's a wavetable synth, but at the end of the day, we're using filters to control it, and we're using additional modulators to perhaps control filters or oscillators, etc. At the end of the day, Massive is still very similar to something like the bass station, like the Virus, like the MiniMoog. Everyone's favorite, Silent. We have oscillators. We have filters. We have amplitude envelopes, we have modulators. Spire, this is one that's become very popular. Same thing, we have oscillators, we have a mix section, we have filters, right? It's all the same. And also we can look at Ableton Live's built-in analog. Oscillator, filter, amplifier, volume over here, and modulators. So that's my really, really quick history of analog synthesis technology. I've skipped so many years and so many steps, but you can do some additional research on that if you're interested. Let's move over to actually looking at the Polysynth here and try to deconstruct it. It looks eerily similar to the Access Virus synthesizer, especially how we have like a mix setting here. We have our LFO settings, we have our filter, and then we have our oscillators. Let's start from left to right, and then we'll try to make some sounds. So here's our oscillator, okay? It has two, but let's focus on one. And you can see we can control the pitch of that here. Now, these by default are automatically going to be key tracked. So if I play a C on my keyboard, it's going to give me a C. If I play a D, it's going to give me a D. If I turn this and decide to go 7 steps out, if I'm playing suddenly a G, okay, it's not going to give me a G. It's actually going to give me 7 steps, 7 semitones below that. It's going to give me a C. So typically with your oscillators, you're going to want to leave the first one alone or just slightly detune it. We'll talk more about that later. We have a control over shape, and this is very much like a wavetable here, very similar to what you can do with the Access Virus. And so I can use either a square wave or a sawtooth wave or something in the middle. Let's leave it on square. And that's all I want to talk about for the oscillators right now. We have our mix settings here. And right now we're turned all the way down to oscillator 1. We could again change the pitch of the entire instrument. Be very careful with that. We could also change the gain going into the filter. So if I hold this, it says pre-filter gain. That lets me know that we're working from left to right, starting with the oscillator and going into the filter section here. So with the filter, I can now take that sound, take those harmonics, and I can tame them or even hype them with a number of different shapes. We have our low passes, we have our high passes, our band pass, and our notch filter here. So from oscillator into filter, into the amplifier here, and then coming out our final volume. So with that turned all the way down, if I'm clicking notes, you can see these yellow lights. Obviously, I'm not getting anything. If I pull this up, I'm getting a click, so I know that we're actually going through all of these sources, but obviously something is wrong, and that has to do with the amplitude envelope here. We're going to talk about the details of this. For now, I'm just going to pull up the sustain level, so I'm just going to get a tone coming out. Perfect. And now that I'm getting sound and I'm just getting one tone, I can go in and maybe change some things. So we're starting with the oscillator, so maybe I want to take it and change the shape to a saw wave instead. I can now run it into the filter, and I'm going to use a low pass, and I'm just going to pull this back. Maybe give it some resonance. And now control the output volume. And just like that, that's the basis of analog synthesis. This is the signal flow, oscillator, filter, amplitude envelope, and final output. So thank you so much for watching, and in the next video we're going to take a look at the Polysynth and how we can get ourselves to a really good initialized state with it. Take care.